Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to follow up with a little bit more carbon-related science for you. Here's a photograph of some of the last remaining Brazilian Atlantic forest with a great big horrible chunk of agriculture in there. I know we've heard a lot about agriculture today, but in this instance, it's not what we want. You may have seen this article that came out last week in Science Advances, showing us that about 70% of the world's forests are now within a kilometre of an edge, so a human-induced edge. Okay, so the only pieces of kind of intact core forest remaining are in the Amazon basin and the Congo basin. Incidentally, I was about to do these calculations for this talk, and then this article was published. So it's just a salutary lesson in you snooze and you lose. So, got to get those calculations done more quickly next time. If we sort of come a little bit closer to home, the UK, we can see that round about half of UK forest area is, actually a bit more than that. 60 to 70% of forest area in the UK is within 100 metres of a forest edge. Now, what does all that mean? Well, we know from classic experiments in the Brazilian Amazon that if you chop forests into smaller and smaller pieces, you get this biodiversity meltdown. This is classic island biogeography theory. And there's just an example showing you that for a continuous forest in this region, we're getting up to around 30 plant seedlings per. I think it's per metre squared. And in a hectare, in 1 hectare chunks, far fewer. Funnily enough, if you come to the UK, it's kind of the opposite situation. Here's some biodiversity advice from the Forestry Commission, showing us actually that if we want lots of biodiversity, then it's actually good to chop the forest up into little chunks. That's essentially because we have had small pieces of forest for a very long time, and the remaining biodiversity in the UK quite likes edgy and scrubby habitats. So, for biodiversity, we're pretty well set. We know what we want in the UK and in other parts of the world. But in terms of fragmentation and the effects of forest edges, there's much less known about the effect on the carbon cycle, and that's something, as we've seen from David Beerling's talk, is of huge interest at the moment. Here's some work from the Global Carbon Project, again showing the various sources and sinks of carbon, and you'll notice that the most erratic and kind of wobbly and uncertain sink that we have is the land sink. So there's a great deal of uncertainty, a lot of variability in what happens on land in terms of forests absorbing carbon dioxide and in some cases releasing it depending on weather and things. Now, why might fragmentation be an issue? Well, if we look at the sort of generalities of what happens at a forest edge, we have increasing sun and wind impacting on the edge of a forest. In this case, Wytham Woods near Oxfordshire, which means it's hotter. It's drier, partly because we have increased evapotranspiration. The trees are transpiring more rapidly at the forest edge, and there's more light coming in. Okay, so big differences between the edge and the interior of the forest, but surprisingly little known in the literature about how that affects the forest carbon cycle. But it probably should, because all of these different processes in the carbon cycle of a forest are affected by things like light availability, temperature, water availability. So, for example, wood decay by fungi, fungal saprotrophs. As temperature increases, they will decay wood more rapidly, and they have certain optima for moisture availability, that kind of thing. So, as part of a large experiment study that went on between 2007 and 2012, managed by the Earthwatch Institute, but in collaboration with Oxford University, Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, we established a number of research plots around Wytham, some in the interior of the woodland, some on the edges in small fragments. And we've been investigating how the various aspects of the carbon cycle are affected. Previous work at Wytham has shown pretty conclusively that near the forest edge we have much more rapid transpiration rates, approaching the potential maximum evapotranspiration rates, and that declines as we go into the forest, and a lot of that appears to be due to the amount of insolation that we're getting. But in terms of how that translates to tree growth and the sequestration of carbon by trees, that's pretty much unknown. So we established within our plots a number of these dendrometer bands, they're called. They allow you to measure tree growth very accurately over time. And we had a large number of citizen science helpers to come and measure these, all from HSBC Bank. They're not all evil, you know. And what we found was, pretty much no effect of edges whatsoever. So this is distance from edge, it's on a log scale, and this is relative growth rate. And no matter how we cut the data, not that we were looking, you know, to prove a point, but essentially there's no real strong signal of edge effect on tree growth, and that could be because there's the balance between photosynthesis and stem respiration, that kind of thing. Further, more detailed experiments will need to be done to determine exactly why we're not seeing that translation. So for tree growth, nothing very obvious going on. So we looked at other aspects of the carbon cycle, and that involved heading to a sawmill and asking for 840 10 by 10 by 10 centimetre beech wood blocks. It's probably the weirdest order they've ever had. I told them it was an art installation, they accepted that. And headed out into the woods and established transects going off from the forest edge into the woodland, and we just let that wood rot for a year and a half or so. And occasionally we'd come along and harvest a wood block, see how much of it had rotted away, and that's going to tell us how the decay rate, that release of carbon from wood blocks, alters with edge. And what we found was that if we calculate the decay constant K as we go into the forest edge, each of these is data from one transect in Wytham, and the colours just show you the different sampling periods. Essentially, you get an increasing decay constant as you move away from the forest edge. So decay is happening more rapidly as we go in. Measurements of the moisture in these wood blocks told us that the effect is probably down to increasing moisture as we go in. The forest edge is warmer and drier. So a strong effect on one important aspect of the carbon cycle. Now, this is a slightly complex graph, but what we wanted to do was to see how the edge effect that we measured compared with the kind of expected effects of weather and climate. So if we plot the decay constant, and so on the y-axis, so this is slow decay, this is rapid decay, against annual precipitation, and then calculate using a published model, published in 2009, the expected decay constants for different temperatures, and these are these curves here. So we can see that as temperature increases, the model expects that the decay constant will increase, and there's also a kind of a quadratic function with precipitation. Okay, so these are model predictions, and these dotted lines are our average decay constants at the edge, and then for the mean of the experiment, and then in the interior of the forest. And so what that tells you is that the difference we see between the edges and the interior of the forest are as large as the largest expected difference that you'd get from different weather conditions. So these edge effects are massive. They're much bigger than you'd expect from annual variability in weather on decay rates. And then if we then extrapolate our decay constants from our transects across the landscape, and then compare the expected landscape scale decay constant with the results that we got from the experiment, we find that if you take edge effects into account, you're actually getting a decay constant that's around 23% lower than you would get from considering all woodlands as being core woodland. So it's a big impact, and as far as I know, this is the only piece of research that's been done on this subject, despite the fact that, as we saw earlier, 70% of forests are pretty close to the edge these days. Now, within Whiteham, as part of this program, some experimental work was conducted, so we can show that if you leave leaves to decay, both on the exterior of the forest and in the interior of the forest, and you either have control or watered conditions. If you water these leaves, then you get more rapid decay, particularly at the forest exterior for ash, but then in the forest interior for oak, reflecting the recalcitrance of these different species. But this kind of reinforces the idea that moisture is an important control on decay rates and the turnover of forest carbon. We've also have a large amount of data on carbon fluxes from the soil itself, which hasn't been analysed. I've just been bending Alan's ear about this data. The answer is still hidden in the data, so I can't tell you about how the soil is responding to forest edge effects yet, but keep your eyes peeled. So to conclude, large fractions of forests are near the edge. The only intact core forest left is pretty much in the Amazon and the Congo Basin, and yet we really don't know much about how the carbon cycle responds to fragmentation. At Whiteham, we've shown that evapotranspiration is affected, but we can't see that tree sequestration as a whole is responding strongly. However, the other part of the equation, respiration from decaying organic matter, does seem to be strongly influenced by edge effects. And so, just finally, I'd just say, without knowledge of what happens at forest edges, we can't really predict how forests are going to respond to climate change in the future. And just to thank all of the many researchers and citizen scientists who are involved in the project. Thank you very much.